Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another of our daily devotions. We're continuing in Psalm 16. In our last study, we were thinking of that last phrase in verse 2, where the psalmist says, I have no good apart from you. Of course, he doesn't mean that as a person he has become a recluse or a monk and he spends all day, every day, meditating on God and just being with God, but rather he's putting God at the center of everything in his life, including his relationships. And that's what the psalmist is saying in verse 3, because in verse 3, he goes on to speak about his relationship with God's people. He says, As for the saints in the land, they are the excellent ones in whom is all my delight. Because David has such a love for God, he also has a love for and he wants to keep company with others who, like him, love the Lord. He finds great joy and delight in the company of his fellow God lovers. You'll notice that he calls them saints. The word means separated ones, those who are set apart from, those who are different from others. The others, of course, being those who are not God's people, the people who are the wicked, idolaters, sinners, people who have no time for and no interest in the God of Scripture. David, of course, could not cut himself off completely from such people. But the point is, he doesn't rush into and does not desire their company. It is God's people that he wants to be with. It is the people of God's company that he enjoyed. If he was asked who he would rather spend time with, God's people or the ungodly, for the psalmist, it was a no-brainer of a question. David also calls his fellow believers the excellent ones, the ones who excel. Charles Spurgeon has a lovely phrase in one of his commentaries on the Psalms. He says that the title His Excellency belongs more to the meanest saint than to the greatest governor. God's people are the excellent ones. What a high and wonderful view the psalmist had of the people of God. Such men and women and young people are highly esteemed. They're highly esteemed by the Lord himself, and they're highly esteemed by the psalmist. David knew that he should think highly of them because God thinks highly of them. And that being the case, David desired their company. Now, David was aware of the fact that God's people had their feelings. Some of them could be tactless, some of them could be annoying at times, some of them had their own personal idiosyncrasies that at times could test one's patience. Some of them were very immature, some of them were more self centered than they ought to have been, and so on. But they are nevertheless still the people of God. And the thing is, of course, folks, that we mustn't forget that some of the feelings that we see in others who are God's people, they see those feelings in us. Far too many of God's people have a low view of their fellow believers. Far too many are quick to criticize other Christians. Far too many Christians are quite content to avoid the company of God's people. Yes, it's okay spending an hour in their company on a Sabbath morning at worship, but that's about as much time as they are willing to give to communing with the saints. Brethren, fellowship with God's people is vital. It's vital for our spiritual growth, development, and well-being. It's vital for us personally, and it's vital to the health of a congregation. It's one of the things that's missing in many churches today. Christians are becoming increasingly isolated and spending their lives apart from other believers. And that shouldn't be the case. We should desire the company of the Lord's people. We should want to spend time with them. Our attitude towards fellow believers should reflect that of the psalmist in this third verse of Psalm 16. As for the saints in the land, they are the excellent ones in whom is all my delight. Can you say that about your fellow believers in your congregation? Do you delight to be in their company? I have to say that as a pastor, when I look around on a Sabbath evening especially, or when I look around at those who gather for the midweek meeting, it seems as though the majority of the people in congregations do not find delight in the company of other believers. And that shouldn't be the case. And I would urge you this morning to reflect on this. See in your fellow believer one in whom the Lord delights. And if the Lord delights in them, you should delight in them. See in your fellow people, your fellow believers, one whom God delights to spend time with. And if God delights to spend time with them, so should you. Work towards developing true fellowship in your congregation. And in order to do that, you ought to think highly of those fellow believers in your congregation. May God help us to reflect on these things, and may you know the blessing of God on you today.